Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video. Well, I am wearing the Fitch Falcons gear today because my eldest son, who just turned 14, has his very first game playing soccer for his high school team today. I can't even believe it. He's in 8th grade, but we do an indoor season for the incoming high school players, the 8th through 11th graders, that goes from December until February. So he's playing with the high school team today, so I can't even believe it, but we're excited. So we're going to be leaving shortly to go see him play. Today we're going to dive into something ugly about every president in U.S. history. I thought this might be interesting. This was actually recommended to me by one of you viewers yesterday on one of our other videos. There's also, I think, one about something good about every president in U.S. history. Now, in keeping with my own personal standard for this channel, I won't be covering any of the recent presidents. I just think that people's emotions get too much involved, and I don't think it's really fair to try and judge recent presidents on their impact anyway. So we will stop at the appropriate time. Let's go ahead and dive in.
George Washington was perhaps one of the least qualified presidents in American history. He grew up in a family of wealthy tobacco farmers who owned slaves, which he inherited and profited from. While a fine military leader, he had little in the way of political experience.
I disagree with just about all of that. Number one, he was not a fine military leader. You've heard me say this before if you've been around for a while. He was a great leader, not a good military leader. He was an incredible leader of men. He knew how to hold a team together. I'm not sure anybody else could have done what he did in terms of keeping the revolution going. But as far as a strategist and a tactician on the battlefield, not very good at all. Got outsmarted repeatedly on the battlefield. And as for political experience, number one, he had his, most of the members of the Continental Congress, most of the founding fathers, were of that planter class, were of that kind of class that didn't have a lot of leadership experience. George Washington was in the Virginia House of Burgesses for nearly 20 years. He probably had as much political experience as anybody in the colonies at the time. So I don't know where they're getting any of that from.
And the role of the presidency was largely shaped around his own skill set, which was mainly military, hence the title Commander-in-Chief. As a war hero and founder, he was shielded from criticism during his own time and ever since. He failed to...
That's true, but like every one of the founding fathers who owned slaves, that criticism's coming back big time now.
Support Republican forces in revolutionary France, responded to a handful of frontier rioters with an army of 15,000 men, and his economic policies consistently favored the wealthy elites, people like himself.
Which is true for anybody who was in power at that time.
John Adams had an obvious contempt for freedom of speech, regularly fining or imprisoning Americans for speaking out against their government. He even arrested and imprisoned a congressman for criticizing the president in a private letter. Yeah,
so it's something called the Alien and Sedition Acts, which I believe some parts of, even up till recently, were on the books. And yeah, really black mark on an otherwise incredible career as one of our founding fathers by John Adams.
Thomas Jefferson was one of the most successful presidents in U.S. history. He was also a major slave owner. He criticized slavery in his writing, but owned about 600 of them. And when a slave rebellion threw off French colonial rule in Haiti, Jefferson's response was to embargo that country. While Haiti's capital of Port-au-Prince was once known as the Paris of the New World.
And his embargo, I don't know enough about Jefferson's mindset to say this for sure, but this is my own view of things. His embargo of Haiti was less about the fact that it was a slave revolt and more about that he absolutely loved France. And that was more about a support for France, I think, than anything else. Now, as for slave owner, I mean, if we're going to go there about something bad about every president, you can say that for something like 80% of the early presidents that were slave owners. I'm not saying we shouldn't criticize that fact, and there was a clear hypocrisy here, but I think everybody pretty well understands that. I wish they would have gone a little deeper in looking for something bad. Like, I don't know, the fact that when Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State to George Washington, he hired a guy named James Callender on the government payroll and then used him to undermine the government that he was a part of. And then when Jefferson became president and James Callender was about to testify that Jefferson had done this in court, a week before he testifies, he ends up drowned in like 2 feet of water, mysteriously.
The country fell into deep poverty as a result of Jefferson's embargo, and today remains one of the poorest countries in the world. James Madison did not adequately prepare the military for the War of 1812, even though he was the guy who pushed for it, which is why the war is also known as Madison's War.
So James Madison, the last president to actually be in the field during a battle, might be the only president who was in the field during a battle. I mean, George Washington led troops during the Whiskey Rebellion, but there wasn't really a battle there. But Madison was at the Battle of Bladensburg, which was the battle outside of Washington that kind of, was a part of that when Washington got burned. And he was not out there commanding the troops, but he was on the field and did have a leadership role in the battle.
The war accomplished little for the United States, but provided British forces the opportunity to occupy Washington and set both the Capitol building and the White House on fire. James Monroe got very little done considering the fact that his only opposition, the Federalist Party, was already fading away by the time of his presidency. His solution for the slavery issue was the Missouri Compromise, which drew a line between free and slave states.
Every president from George Washington to James Buchanan kicked the can down the road on the slavery issue. That is not unique to James Monroe.
He claimed that the compromise had saved the Union, but in reality he was just setting the stage for the Civil War. As Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams authored the Monroe Doctrine, claiming all of North and South America to be part of the sphere of influence of the United States.
And we should mention, too, that in the early part of the U.S. history, Secretary of State was the main jumping off point for future presidents. Many of the early presidents, Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, I think, Madison, John Quincy Adams, these were people who had served as Secretary of State.
While you may have seen it as a measure against colonialism at the time, it was soon to be used as a rationale for near constant intervention in Latin American politics, including the overthrow of even democratically elected governments. Andrew Jackson forcibly removed tens of thousands of Native Americans
Trail of
from their
Tears.
homes. Those who resisted were met with hostility, resulting in slaughter and the Second Seminole War.
And at one point, Seminole, at one point he had a case against the Cherokee Native American tribe, who were quite civilized by white people's standards and had their own system of government and everything. And they took a case to the Supreme Court. They won. The Cherokee won the case in the Supreme Court, and then Andrew Jackson promptly completely ignored it and said they issued their ruling, now let's see them enforce it, and then just completely ignored the Supreme Court's ruling. And yeah, the Trail of Tears all on him.
Martin Van Buren's incompetence is widely credited for the economic depression following the Panic of 1837. William Henry Harrison...
Well, we didn't really talk much about Martin Van Buren there, but let's just mention one thing kind of on the side here. Epic sideburns, okay? I mean, they weren't called that yet, but dang, dude has his hair going right into the sideburns. Completely superficial thing to observe, but anyway.
Following the Panic of 1837. William Henry Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in American history, on a cold, rainy day, wearing no coat or hat, and rode in on horseback rather than a closed carriage. The oldest president ever elected at the time, he promptly caught pneumonia and died. Yeah,
spent a month as president. I mean, barely even really anything you can judge on the guy as president. Had been a great general before the war, or before the presidency. His campaign slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too, because John Tyler was his vice presidential candidate. And Tippecanoe is what he was known as. He had famously won the Battle of Tippecanoe.
John Tyler was never elected president and seemed to have a great deal of disdain for democracy. He was nearly impeached after vetoing absurd numbers of bills in defiance of the custom that presidents should only veto what they deem unconstitutional. He then focused on annexing the Republic of Texas, which a decade prior was officially part of Mexican territory.
And we should mention about John Tyler as well, elected to the Confederate Congress. He died in 1862, so he never took office as a Confederate congressman, but did get elected to the Confederate Congress.
Polk completed the annexation of Texas, thereby completing the theft of Mexican land, which triggered the Mexican-American War of 1848. He was an aggressive expansionist, not just of U.S. territory, but also of presidential powers.
Absolutely all true, but I think by and large viewed as one of our best presidents in that time period when there were a lot of pretty weak presidents. Only serves one term by his own choice. And that was something he campaigned on, that he was only going to run for one term. But this was basically, this is one of those guys who did exactly what he said he was going to do when he was getting elected. Now, people didn't campaign the way that they do today. In fact, it was kind of viewed as beneath the dignity of the office of president to openly campaign for the office. But in the campaign, in the election time leading up to the vote, that was stuff he ran on, was basically that we're going to annex Texas. We're going to focus on the Southwest. Remember, the two overriding political issues of the first half, well, maybe even the first 2/3 of the 19th century in the United States are slavery and manifest destiny. This idea that the United States is destined to be one nation from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And Polk was one of those people who had more to do with both of those issues than pretty much any president.
Like George Washington, Zachary Taylor had military experience but no political experience before becoming president. As such, he accomplished little, aside from being the last president to own slaves.
Yeah, I mean, slave owner with no experience. It depends on how you look at the idea of the last president to own slaves. In terms of when he was president, yes. The last person to serve as president who ever owned a slave was Ulysses S. Grant. Now, I'm not saying that as a criticism of Grant. He was gifted a slave by his father-in-law, who he promptly turned around and freed. So I'm not going to go there and say Grant was a slave owner. But I guess it depends on how you look at that issue.
Millard Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Act into law, which required citizens of free states to return escaped slaves to their masters.
Which is interesting because Fillmore was from New York. He was a northerner. You have a couple of these northern presidents who are very pro-South. Franklin Pierce is another one. James Buchanan as well. These presidents in the 1850s were pretty much horrible, all of them.
He also joined the deeply anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, Know-Nothing Party.
I was going to say, who knew nothing?
Franklin
I
Pierce
saw that.
broke with Monroe's Missouri Compromise to support the even more controversial Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed for the expansion of slavery into the West. He also tried but failed to annex Cuba.
And there was a lot of that going around with U.S. presidents focused on trying to gobble up territory in the Caribbean. Grant tried to get the what became the Dominican Republic, and he had an agreement in place to do it, but couldn't get it ratified by the Senate.
James Buchanan was a doughface, a northerner with Southern sympathies.
Yeah.
Toward the end of his presidency, many of the states that would become the Confederacy seceded from the Union. While credited with freeing the slaves, that oversimplification ignores the role of abolitionist groups such as the Quakers and the very real role blacks had in emancipating themselves.
Here's what I don't understand about making that statement. Any president who did anything significant, you could say that. You could say, well, yeah, he did that, but there were all these other groups that were fighting for this, and so he can't take all the credit. No, that's always true. There's no president who did anything that there weren't some groups that were also lobbying for it, and that there weren't other people involved in that decision. I think there's a lot of things you could criticize Lincoln for without that being your one. How about the fact that he suspends habeas corpus? Again, I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just saying if you're going to criticize, Abraham Lincoln bent the Constitution about as far as you can bend it without just outright defying it.
Lincoln repeatedly said he believed in white supremacy, and early on in the war didn't allow his generals to free slaves in captured territories.
And that was a political issue. Pretty much every president at that time was probably, you could label them as a white supremacist. Again, not justifying it, just the reality of the mindset of most white people at the time.
In point of fact, he didn't believe that freed slaves could or should one day become full American citizens. True. Andrew Johnson opposed federally guaranteed rights for African Americans. Ulysses...
arguably one of the one or two worst presidents we've ever had, and you literally spend 5 seconds on something bad about him. I could do entire episodes of videos about the crap that Andrew Johnson did that screwed this country up, especially for the newly freed slaves. I mean, if you are going to pin the 100 years plus of Jim Crow and segregation and just downright viciousness that was done to freed slaves in the South after the Civil War on one person, it's on this guy. He also looks just like Tommy Lee Jones.
Rights for African Americans. Ulysses S. Grant was a great general, but not a great president. He ushered in the Gilded Age, and his close associates were constantly steeped in scandal.
That's true, and a lot of that has more to do with Grant being too much trusting of people who took advantage of him. But he also did some really good things. He basically eradicated the Klan during Reconstruction. He created the Justice Department specifically to go after the Klan and groups like them. He did a lot of good things, but he also fell victim to people in his administration taking advantage of him.
Hayes pushed for the assimilation of Native Americans into white culture, crushed a railroad strike with federal troops, and despite serving as president, no one today knows who the hell this guy is.
I don't know about that. And again, of all the things you could criticize Hayes for, the stuff he chose is stuff other presidents did too. Again, you can still criticize him for it, but how about the fact that the only reason he became president is because he made a corrupt deal to pull all the federal troops out of the South? Now, granted, public perception, public opinion in the North had turned decidedly against Reconstruction, so it was going to happen anyway, but he basically made a deal. It was a contested election. If you remember the 2000 election with Bush and Gore, got nothing on this one. 1876 election, there were two states whose electoral votes were in doubt. And if either one of them had gone to Samuel Tilden, the Democratic nominee, then he wins the White House. But both of them going to Hayes gives Hayes a one electoral vote win in the White House. For the White House, and they put a commission together to decide who, because both votes were contested, who was going to win those two states, and in return for him promising to end Reconstruction, both states went to Hayes. So they called him Rutherford.
Like William Henry Harrison, Garfield died before getting much of anything done.
That's what you say bad about Garfield. He died before getting anything done. But I guess, you know what, honestly, there's not much negative to say about Garfield. I think he would have been one of our greatest presidents of all time if he had lived. And it's one of the big what-ifs for me, how different the world could have been if Garfield had been elected. Certainly one of our most brilliant people who's ever been president.
A. Arthur was widely admired by contemporaries like Mark Twain, but has been largely forgotten over time, possibly because he never achieved anything of note.
Again, I don't know if that's a criticism. It's just really more of a meh than it's something ugly about him.
Grover Cleveland oversaw a suffering economy and cracked down on unions. Benjamin Harrison was notorious.
There's a lot you could say about Cleveland, but I'll kind of let that one go. And Benjamin Harrison taxed the rich to murder the poor. I'll be interested to hear what he means about that.
Suffering economy and cracked down on unions. Benjamin Harrison was notorious for wasting government funds. His policies toward Native Americans were hostile to say the least. He oversaw the bloody Battle of Wounded Knee against the Sioux and tried to annex Hawaii.
Tried to annex Hawaii, which was done by McKinley, but I don't know if I put Wounded Knee on Benjamin Harrison. I put that on the officers on the ground at Wounded Knee with the 7th Cavalry who did that. I just don't know if I blame the president for that. He had the same policies that most of the presidents before him did when it came to Native Americans.
William McKinley actually annexed Hawaii. He supported imperialism even in his presidential campaign, and seized Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines after the Spanish-American War rather than freeing them.
Yeah, and that's all fair criticism of William McKinley, but I think it was kind of the mindset of most of the people who wanted to be world powers at the time. It was a time when England, France, the Dutch, the Germans, they were all trying to gobble up colonies around the world, and the U.S. was getting in on it. again, not a justification or a defense of it. It's just the reality of the world at the time.
Teddy Roosevelt was obsessed with his own image and masculinity. He joined the Rough Riders to invade Cuba to show just how tough he was, then spent his presidency pushing around Congress and Latin American republics alike.
I don't know if I agree with any of that. Was he a masculine dude? Yeah, I mean, probably the toughest dude we've ever had as president. A lot you could say positive about Theodore Roosevelt. But did he do it to show how tough he was? No, I think he was a patriotic guy who had to be in the middle of that stuff. And so he steps down from his government position to, lead the Rough Riders down into Cuba. And that's just who he was. I don't think it was like, I got to show everybody how tough I am. That's just how he was.
He also dishonorably discharged 170 black GIs after they were shot by white racist townies. Fat. Not enough? He was also expected to follow in the footsteps of his mentor Teddy Roosevelt, but deviated from Roosevelt's policies so extremely that the Rough Rider left the Republican Party to form a new one.
Again, I don't know if that's something ugly about Taft, that Taft wanted to chart his own path and didn't just do what he was told by Theodore Roosevelt. If anything, that I would think, whether you agree with him or not, would be a compliment to Taft, that he wasn't going to just do what Roosevelt expected of him.
During Taft's presidency, the progressive wing of the Republican Party split off to join the Democrats, mainly because of the Bollinger controversy. Supported eugenics. Perhaps...
That's all we're going to say? That's all we're going to say about Woodrow Wilson? The guy who screened a Klan movie in the White House? The guy who... I mean, don't even get me started on the racist policies of Woodrow Wilson. He was born in the South. He was actually the first Southern president since before the Civil War, even though he was in New Jersey. I think he was governor of New Jersey at the time he was elected president, had been president of Princeton University, but he was from the South. He was born in Virginia, grew up in Georgia, I think. One of his earliest memories was seeing Jefferson Davis ride through town as he was fleeing from federal troops at the end of the Civil War. But man, there's so much you could say about Wilson that I'm not going to get into today. Same with Harding. There's a reason Ohio, and I'm an Ohioan, that we haven't had a president since Harding, because he was that bad.
The most corrupt president in history, the most prominent of his scandals was the Teapot Dome scandal, in which members of Harding's administration were caught taking bribes from private corporations to lease oil reserves in Wyoming. Failed to act during the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, then helped to build the economic policies that created the Great Depression and the 1929 stock market crash.
Don't know if I'd blame Coolidge for the stock market crash. There's a lot of blame to go around on that, but I'm not sure I feel like Coolidge is responsible for that, but all right.
Herbert Hoover failed to recover the economy during the Great Depression and supported Prohibition. One of the greatest presidents.
Supported Prohibition. A lot of people supported Prohibition, but all right, I get it.
Presidents in American history, FDR is not without his faults either. He married a distant blood relative and proceeded to have several extramarital affairs.
You can't call him marrying Eleanor Roosevelt incest. She was like a fifth cousin. I mean, it wasn't even close. She was Theodore Roosevelt's niece. He actually walked her down the aisle in her marriage to Franklin Roosevelt. But nah, you can't call that incest. Come on. Fifth cousins, I mean, their common ancestor was like 150 years before they got married. Yeah, come on.
Also, there were the Japanese internment camps.
Give him that.
Truman was the first and only human being in history to order the dropping of nuclear weapons on civilians.
Not gonna criticize that, but I guess if you're gonna look for something to criticize Truman, I guess that's probably it.
He also contributed more than any other president to the building of an American empire and started the Korean War. Eisenhower started the Vietnam War, threatened to use nuclear weapons to end the Korean War, and developed plans to blow up the moon. He also authorized the CIA to take out the democratically elected leader of Iran and install the Shah, creating a lasting rift between Iran and the United States. Failed to get out of Vietnam, tried and failed to overthrow Fidel Castro, recklessly threatened to use nuclear weapons to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I don't know if that was reckless. I feel like that was the right thing to do in that situation. You had to keep nuclear weapons out of Cuba. You had to as president. I'm not going to fault him for that.
And humiliated the First Lady with near-constant philandering.
Yeah, which you could say about Harding and Franklin Roosevelt and Bill Clinton and Grover Cleveland, and probably a number of other presidents too.
A total failure when it came to the war in Vietnam. This one's obvious, right?
Barely
elected to end
being.
the war in Vietnam, but before doing that, proceeded to expand the fighting into 2 other countries.
I'm going to wrap it up right there. I'm not going to go any further than Nixon because I think we're getting dangerously close to the part where people are going to start arguing in the comment section. We're going to have that anyway anytime we deal with presidents, but I'll take it. It's not a problem. So let me know your thoughts. Do you agree with me, disagree with me? Do you agree with them, disagree with them? What would you have added? What would you have said instead about each of those presidents? And then we'll probably come back in a day or two and do there something good about every president in U.S. history. Check out the link in the description below to the original content creator. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.